So I thought, why don't we move on to water use in agriculture? And I'm going to set us up as a, with my kind of my first best take on this, and then we'll run aground into the institutional realities in a second. But in agriculture, so agriculture is the biggest user of water in Pakistan, 90-something%, right? Big chunk of our fresh water goes there. And again, like, if you pose the question of what do you do here to an economist, they're going to say, well, yeah, you just got to price it right, and then of course water will go to that farmer that needs it the most, right? That farmer that values it the most. So it's sort of pricing it at the marginal value of water. And it's not like this is unheard of. Like, we've seen examples of this work in the world. The example that I think by this point any Pakistani who's ever said the word water knows about the Murray-Darling in Australia, right? And then there's the water markets in California. I mean, so the point is, we've seen water markets be set up and succeed. Like they're exemplars of how to do this. I mean, I say this without knowing too much nuance. I'm sure there's some economists out there torn it to shreds, but for the most part, you get really good press on these things, right? Like, the fact is, the water markets can exist, and you can price water, and it seems to work. And work that I did in the south of Punjab, so you've kind of worked more here in this kind of northern bits of Punjab and interacted with the irrigation bureaucracy. So I did some work down in the south in this canal system called the Hakra Branch Canal. It's really interesting because this canal runs north-south, and it was built by the Indians. They built it they paid for it, and it has dual use. Not only does it irrigate some land, but it also prevents Indian tanks from entering Pakistan. So it's an interesting little canal system. So I did some work over there, and there's a gripe in here somewhere, and I'll express this and when we conclude our conversation. But I spent this summer doing measurement work. I went with this flow meter, and I was going around doing measurements of discharge in the canal system, because that data isn't there, not at the finer levels. That's my gripe. So I put this study. So I did this study, and we found that you could see an increase of something like 14% in the profits of farmers if water was better allocated. If it was allocated efficiently, you'd find this bump in farmer profits. It's a lot of money lying around. Like, it's money we need to get to farmers. So if we were in that first best world and we had a market, we'd get an increase in our efficiency. So, but what's the reality we're in, Maira?
So I want to start by asking you a question as a non-economist. When you say water markets, right? So if I'm looking at 2 transactions, is that a market? Do I have a market? Like, what are the ingredients for a?
Yeah.
So tell me more.
Right.
Right.
So.
Like, what are the boxes that I should check to be able to?
Right. So my Econ 100 students are going to laugh at me when I say this. So broadly, I think you need a lot of buyers and you need a lot of sellers. That's the first thing. And you don't want the market to be too thin, where it's just 2 or 3 transactions or very minimal number of transactions. I don't know what the cutoff is, but the point is you need lots of buyers and lots of sellers. And so on a system like this, where you've got these man-made rivers, it is feasible. I think we've thought this through, and it is very feasible that some guy who's down that way on the one end of the canal, and there's another guy higher up the channel. In theory, they can trade water because there's this channel with which you can do it. So it's possible. I mean, I've thought that through, and I think we can do it. I think it's theoretically possible. But what you need is, A, the ability to move around the water. So you've got that channel. You've got lots of buyers and sellers. You've got lots of people on these canals who presumably do want to buy water. Like, maybe there's some guy who thinks I need more water, right? Like, and then you need to be able to connect them. You need the actual market. You need an ability to connect the buyers and sellers. So the way they do it I'm sure I'm grossly simplifying, but the example of the Murray-Darling is where they have this bank.
Right.
They have an intermediary. They have somebody who connects buyers to sellers. You need to be able to do that efficiently. I mean, in theory, somebody at the head of our 45 canal commands should be able to sell to somebody somewhere in the bottom in Badin or somewhere, right? Like somebody in Kasur should be able to sell to somebody in Badin. That's theoretically possible. But how does that guy say, hey man, I want to buy some water? So you need an intermediary. So I think those are some of the big ingredients. But I'm sure that, you know, like there's lots more nuance that goes into it.
Yeah, no, I ask in particular because when in the initial phases of my research, one of my anxieties was my proposal said I'm going to study markets in water.
Right.
And where is the market? Right? I don't see a market.
Yeah,
is this a market? Is this not a market?
Slightly abstract
there are all
idea,
these people who are doing these
Yeah.
transactions. They have these exchange networks that are really old also. They're new ones. They're so lively. But does this look like a market, right? And with a formal actor, for instance, like these bottled water companies, Nestle, Coke, Pepsi, of course, there's a bottled water market.
Yes.
It's easier
you can
to
buy
you know,
water,
right?
Yeah.
And
There's
so
where you buy water.
the anxiety was that these kinds of arrangements would get lumped and thrown into this category of, you know, informal markets. But what does that really mean?
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
So what I've seen, like in these parts, is that it's very common for people to do these. They do these transactions and they exchange their water entitlements, right? Like you just said. So there's a varabandi for a Moga. A varabandi is.
Wait, do you want? Yeah, say more
right,
about
right.
what
So,
is varabandi?
The varabandi is a water rotation schedule. It's a water. It's a roster. It's a timetable. And what happens is that you divide the time. 7 days a week, you divide it amongst land holdings, right?
Okay.
And so
there's these farmers who are all along the channel,
Right,
and so it's a turn, like it's a timetable for who gets water when, huh?
Yes.
Right.
And what happens is that, so based on the land holding, you will get X hours, Y minutes of water every 7 days.
Right.
Right.
Which
And
points to
then-
an interesting feature of our canal system, which is that it's like a river.
Right.
Whatever's in there is what people get.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And when it's your turn, then everybody else on that Moga, you basically get all the water. Right?
Okay.
So
Everybody
that's
else
how
shuts
it
their
works.
gates,
Everybody
right.
shuts their
Yeah.
gate, right? So all the water that's in the khal is then it then comes to your khal.
Yeah.
So what's happening is that there are these timetables, and you know there is a version that the irrigation bureaucrats will have, right? The Zilladar will have a copy, the Nehri Patwari will have a copy. It'll say itne baje this person gets it, itne baje inka hai, itne baje inka hai. But it's very, very common for people to have switched those around.
Right, so there's this
Something-
formal
right,
in the
yeah.
department
Right,
timetable, and
right.
then the one that people have actually
right,
agreed upon.
Right. And it's not really a big deal because everybody knows,
Yeah.
right? Like the people know, the Zilladars know, the Patwaris know, everybody
Right.
knows it
It's
works
common
for
knowledge,
everyone,
right.
right?
Okay.
What's interesting is that when there's a dispute is when all of this suddenly sort of, freezes or becomes an issue. Acha, so now what do we do? And also, in my understanding, one of the ways that a transition from a pakki varabandi to a kachi varabandi, the other way around, from a kachi varabandi to a pakki varabandi happens is when there's a dispute that the water users can't resolve amongst themselves.
Okay.
And so then they go to the department and say, hello, you come and sort of, mediate.
Right.
So an official or a pakki varabandi is a state sanctioned one.
Right.
Right. So what happens is that when there's a dispute, then the department, you can draw upon the department.
Okay.
Whereas in a kachi varabandi, it's really up to water users.
You guys to work it
right?
out, right? Yeah.
But
Okay.
if I'm not wrong, the majority of varabandis, at least in the Punjab, are now pakki varabandis.
Okay.
Yeah, if I'm not wrong.
So this is really interesting. So there, it seems like, yeah. So this, this is this classic work by Bandra Godai, who talks about the formal, then there's the informally agreed, and then there's the actual, what actually happens on a given day, right? But it's an interesting point. Like the fact is that in a sense, this shows you that markets almost want to happen, quote unquote. Like there are people trading turns. It's limited, it's small, it's very local, but there's this desire for a market. And the reason people are doing that is that like the time just may not suit me. My crop needs water now. Can you give me your turn and I'll give you mine some other time, right? So there's these kind of favors that are being exchanged. Yeah. So I wanted to ask you, this hyper locality, and you've mentioned this character a few times, the Patwari. What is their role in all of this? Like, how do these guys play into this? The Patwari,
So
especially when it comes to water, do they have a role in this?
Yeah. So it's helpful to see. It's been helpful for me to see the irrigation department as having two wings. Right? So there's a revenue wing, and then there's a engineering wing.
Right.
So the revenue wing, you have the Nehri Patwaris amongst the lowest tier.
Right.
Then you have the Zilledar. The Zilledar, then above the Zilledar is a deputy collector, and then there's a collector. So the Nehri Patwari is one of the most central nodes of this bureaucracy in a way, right? So all the real stuff that's happening on the ground, how do the people on top find out?
Right.
It is channeled through the Nehri Patwari, right?
Okay.
And here too, class differential and sort of, you know, the powerful landed people, the tenants, the less powerful ones who have temporary holdings or much smaller holdings, and how those differentials play out through officials like the Nehri Patwari is also really,
right.
I mean, interesting. It was one of the things that I saw up close during my fieldwork. You know that if I'm a connected, influential person, then one of the ways that I can try to put pressure on the department to get my work done is to sort of, you know, go at the higher level.
Right.
So I won't go the way that the 1873 Act stipulates that you go. You start at the lower tier, the case works its way up, then there's an appeal, you appear before the Zilledar, then, you know. So there's a whole procedure, there's a way of doing things. But if I want to bypass that, then of course I will try and go from the, you know, top.
Okay.
So what the Nehri Patwaris are doing, it's actually, it's quite amazing what they're doing, is they're fielding pressure from so many different directions, right? And this often happens, what will happen is that somebody, this is just one example, one of the very common cases in the department is that there's a Varabandi and people want to change it. Somebody's, you know, added more land, so they want to, you know, change it, and you need consensus for it. Everybody has to be gathered, the department representatives have to be there, and you sort of, so the Nehri Patwari, there will be pressure from the senior officials, right? So there's a call in the morning, hey, you should try and favor this person. Then there's a call from another tier, also above the Nehri, hey, you should try and favor this person or this person, right? And then the Nehri Patwari is also working in the midst of all these other compulsions, right? Like these day-to-day compulsions, going through people's lands, going onto people's lands, maintaining, creating relationships with people.
Right.
The Patwari knows all these people really well, right? So how the work of, say, tax assessment happens is very much a function of all these water tax assessment. It's very much a function of all these different, you know.
So it's very hyper local somehow. Like that's kind of where the rubber meets the road. So just thinking, you know, like I said that, you know, in an ideal world where we can price our water, we can price irrigation water and have a irrigation water market. But obviously, again, we're not in the best world. We're in a second best. And in the second best world, maybe one way to rationalize water use may be that we could somehow bump up the tax. Right now, the tax it's basically, it's peanuts. It's nothing. There's no tax. I mean, essentially people are paying nothing for water.
It's I think Rabi is 55.5
per acre.
And Kharif is 80.5 rupees.
There you go. That's nothing. You can buy a bottle of Nestle water for that. So you know, it's not very substantial, and so maybe one way to rationalize it is that somehow this tax increases, and we get all, you know, like you talk to people in the bureaucracy and they say, yes, we want to increase the tax, but they're somehow unable to, you know, like, and I think part of it has to do with what you were just talking about, which is this local pressure. The fact is that there are landed, you know, farmers, big farmers who would resist it, who don't want to pay a penny more, and then they've got channels through which they influence, like maybe the Patwari is one, and you know, so yeah, there's this reality where somehow we're stuck.
So amongst the engineers, again, this is mostly the Punjab irrigation
Mhm.
people. There's a lot of frustration that Abhyana has become so politicized, right?
Right.
And the
Yeah, it feels that way,
and
doesn't
so
it?
then
Like,
you say,
yeah.
"Acha, say more. What do you mean? How?" Right? And that the department again and again tries to raise Abhyana.
Yes.
And the issue dies down at the ministerial level.
Yes.
It's not politically palatable.
Right.
And I mean, of course, there's something there too, right? You don't expect that it will be, wildly popular.
No, right. It's a tax is tax, right?
Right.
Like, yeah.
And but then that's the thing, right? What kind of dialogue or consensus are we looking for
Right.
when such decisions have to be made?
Right.
Right. And when do some decisions become urgent?
Right.
Right. And so just to add on that, so the point about the Abhyana, like these rates, they did something interesting. The department did something in 2003 when they instituted a flat rate.
Okay.
And I'm so saying this in particular also because I think it ties together some of the threads that we've touched upon in a really surprising way.
Okay.
So they instituted a flat rate in 2003 and they said all Rabi crops, this is the charge, and all Kharif crops is the crop.
I see. So usually it does vary by
Right, it
the
used
type
to vary
of,
by crop.
I
So
see,
it used to be
right.
crop-based assessment.
Right,
So
right.
sugarcane
Right.
will be assessed at, and this will be assessed at
cash
rice,
crops
right?
versus,
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
So that would happen, and then they said now we have a flat rate, and the reason that nearly everybody gives to me for why that change was made is because there's so much corruption at the lower tiers, and to fix it we've taken that discretion away from the Patwari.
I
That the
see.
Nehri Patwari no longer. So I said, well, what do you mean? Was this where most of the corruption was happening? What form does it take? So it's really interesting that what was happening was that if there's an acre here which had sugarcane, somebody's going sugarcane. Say I'm the person who's going sugarcane, and you're the Nehri Patwari, and you come and you say I'm here to do this assessment. It looks like I'll do my measurements, and you have an acre. This is called Girdavri. Right?
Okay.
There's a proper way to do it. So they say, Acha, you have an acre and you're growing sugarcane. This is a rate for sugarcane, so this is your figure. It's Y. So then I'll offer to do this deal with you, and I'll say,
Right.
hey, listen, why don't you say it's 0.5 acres of maize and 0.2 of something and 0.2 of something, and just 0.1 acres of sugarcane.
Sugarcane, the expensive one.
And right, and so then the total sum becomes much less than Y.
And we share some of the difference.
I'll give you some, and then
Okay.
I keep some, and so it benefits the
Right.
two of us.
Okay.
So for me, what was really interesting there was that there are again all these transactions that people are doing.
Right.
It's just that that the accountability is not to this one
Yeah.
central.
No, it's all very
node.
local
Right,
seeming, yeah.
right. And
that's so interesting.
yeah,
That's the reality that
right.
any movement toward rationalizing water use has to play in, So I was going to say, on that note, let's talk about groundwater,
Right.
another very local sort of
Yeah,
issue.
yeah.
And you read, so going back to what you said, the go-to document, right? You
Right.
read Pakistan's economy running dry. It's kind of a shame that that's still our go-to document. It's very old now. But
That's true.
you go to that, and it's also got this very crisis kind of feel about it. And when it comes to groundwater, there's some alarming stuff in there. Groundwater depleting. You got to do something. 15 to 20 million tons of salt dumped into our basin every
Right.
year because it's coming from the Himalayas. It's picking up all this mineral salt on the way and
Right.
dumping it in our system. So it's very alarmist. But then on the other hand, you read some more contemporary stuff. Folks at the World Bank, Ghazala Mansouri, Hanan Jacobi, and they're talking about, Jacobi's got this nice graph where he shows that the decline in Pakistan's Punjab province, depletion in groundwater is actually there's a very, very gentle, if non-existent trend. There's not really much decline. I mean, in contrast to, for example, Indian Punjab or Haryana, where it's really plummeted, the water over there, water table. So you got these kind of contrasting positions, where one saying crisis, decline, and one saying, no, actually it's not that bad. I think fundamentally what it means is that there's great heterogeneity.
Right.
You go to Balochistan and you draw from an aquifer over there. You're really that aquifer is going to see decimation because that's not recharged as frequently, say, as an aquifer in Punjab, which gets all this canal seepage, right? So So yeah, I mean, just to kind of set us on that, like, you know, I know you wanted to share some thoughts on groundwater, the fact that there's a lot of usage and complementarity. So yeah, do you want to say a couple of things about that?
Sure. So, what I see in the Lahore and Kasoor parts is, like you're saying. So actually, that's a really cool point where you cite this other research where you don't see this very alarming
Decline,
right?
yeah.
Because it's just this. The common sense is that it is declining at a really alarming rate.
Yeah.
That nobody's just relying on canal water, right? Everybody's
in agriculture, people are
right? You have to. It's not enough for the kind of cultivation that's happening and the intensity of cultivation and the frequent the cropping cycles.
Yes.
Everybody's using groundwater. Everybody's also buying groundwater.
Right. So that's another place where this kind of market has emerged already, right? This has been well documented. Yeah.
And here, it appears that in a particular area, everybody will know what the going rate is, and so in some parts that I was doing my work, this is almost 2 years ago now, this field work, it was about 300 or 350 rupees per hour.
Per hour of use?
Per hour of use.
Interesting,
right?
okay.
And there
so if you're a hard-nosed farmer, you can say, I'm going to charge you about 400 rupees an hour, and you can have the water from my well.
Right, I can say, meri tubel hai, meri zameen hai, come take whatever you want. Then, but then there are other arrangements also, right? Some people, what they'll do is, some of them will get together and install a tube well. So it'll be jointly owned.
Right.
One of them will sort of, operate it or whatever. And then what happens is that you bring your own diesel.
Okay. Bring your own diesel.
Bring your own diesel and run it.
BYOD.
Right.
Yeah.
And the thing is that a lot of people will then avail the option, right? So you don't even have to be one of the initial partners in it. As long as you have your own diesel, they will let you do your thing.
Operate the pump.
Very, very infrequently, but sometimes I also have come across, and these are more wealthy people.
Right.
Who will take offense to when I ask, oh, acha, so do you let people use this water? What rates do you charge? And then they'll say some things like, nahi, aise chote kaam, hum pani nahi lete, pani to bas hum de dete hain.
Okay, okay.
But that's infrequent.
Okay.
And it's, but there too, it's interesting that, this is not just this act of giving.
Right. And presumably there's some exchange there.
Right. And then I think it also creates this expectation that down the road, if for instance there's a dispute, you need witnesses for a khal dispute, for instance.
Okay.
Now the person whose land you're taking water from, you are
kind of indebted to them.
Right. You are not going to go out and say, this person is at fault. Yeah. So it's this interesting way of almost where giving water works as this surreptitiously as this way of patronage.
Right.
And, but yes, there's a lot of buying and selling and
and the cool thing is that there seems to be this great variety in the types of exchanges that happen. One, I would say it's again hyper local. It's got to be focused on your own tertiary canal at best, right? Maybe neighboring farms. Best case, maybe you can dump some of that water into the tertiary canal and send it down to somebody else. But it seems very very local. It's got to be neighbors, right? And the other interesting thing is the variety. Like there's the hard-nosed types who'll say, yeah, I'll charge you 300 rupees an hour, 400 rupees an hour, and you can have the water. Or you can be really nice and say, bring your own diesel. And then there's the patronage type setting as well. Related to this, I mean, there's research that, it's kind of a blend of some of what you've said. Many times large farms they have tenant farmers on them, right? And so the person who owns the farm owns the well. Right. So he charges the tenant, but what they'll do is they'll charge the tenant a lower rate than what they'll charge a neighboring farm. So they're kind of being nicer to their tenants in some sense. So it's incorporating some of that, what you said, this kind of, I guess, semi-patronage, goodwill kind of thing in there, Okay, so I do want to, so just to bring us back, it occurred to me, again, as I went over that World Bank report, and then you see some of these more contemporary perspectives on groundwater, crisis or not crisis, right? And so I was just thinking, depending on what perspective you adopt, changes what you think you'll do, or what not you think, what you ought to do. right? So if you're in crisis mode, then what you want to do is you want to get people to use less groundwater because it's depleting, it's going away. We need to stop them, right? And that means controlling somehow extraction through tax or whatever it is, and some kind of enforcement. That sounds very difficult. But if you adopt the other perspective where in fact we don't see much decline in, at least in Punjab aquifers, and again, I'm totally simplifying. There's a lot of complexity here, right? There's issues of salinity, and there's parts that are still waterlogged, and like there's a lot of heterogeneity. But broadly, the trend for Punjab is not massive depletion. It's gentle to non-existent depletion. So if you adopt that perspective, it tells you, is groundwater maybe a way out of poverty? You know, like is it that we in fact maybe need to encourage poorer farmers? We need to get them to use groundwater so that they use that as a ladder to get out of poverty, that their children go to good schools and are fed well, and so they get out of this, poor existence. And I say this, I mean, obviously, again, there's lots of heterogeneity, but I'm going to some anecdotes. When I did fieldwork in South, we spoke about this earlier as well, before this conversation. When I was doing my fieldwork in southern Punjab, like this place it's difficult, right? This is where the tendrils of the desert are meeting agricultural land. This is marginal land, and there's these incredibly poor people out there. And they're incredibly hospitable. They're warm and loving, and they like this guy shows up and wants to do some measurements, and they're throwing tea and biscuits and whatever they have at me. They want to be hospitable, but they're desperately poor as well. And you anecdotally you ask farmers, how is it? How are you profitable? Are you making ends meet? And everybody says, no, it's terrible. It's awful. We're barely making ends meet. I'm in a loss. And so I say to them, why are you doing this then? Why don't you just exit? And so just going back to this point, that maybe groundwater is and I'm simplifying again, but maybe it's a strategy to help them get out of this, and get their next generations out of this and not be trapped in this sort of weird poverty,
No, that's a really important point to recognize, right? That there's something. So I think Tushar Shah has written. He has a really great book on. He's written about this groundwater revolution, quote unquote, right?
Right.
There's something really democratizing about this, right?
Right.
You don't need to have the capital to navigate this complex bureaucracy, and you can still maybe do agriculture. Right?
Wait, so that's a really great point. So when you say that, you mean that now I've got my own well, I don't need to interact with the canal guys anymore.
Then I'm not perhaps as dependent, on them.
Yeah.
And capital to navigate the bureaucracy is not just how rich I am, but all kinds of things, like do I have the social capital, do I have the social standing, right?
Right.
I mean, the thing is that these are all, sure, people know each other, but then also in these parts of Lahore and Qusur, people are selling land. There's a lot of transaction, right? A lot of agricultural land is coming into housing societies. A lot of people are moving. So what some of them are doing is they're selling their land holdings to these housing societies, buying more zarai zameen elsewhere, right? Like moving further away from the city, like the big city. So you have new neighbors, right? So this is no longer, these villages of old times where everybody was best friends with everybody else. And I mean, I think there's so much romanticism even when you project it backwards, but that's not really happening here.
Right.
You have neighbors, many of them don't even live there, right? A lot of expatriates. Also, interestingly, a lot of people who have since moved to the Middle East but have decided to, buy land here. So yes, there's this
democratizing angle to it. You don't have to rely on you don't have to have a social network or social capital with these patwaris and the bureaucracy.
Right, you can be, you're not just at their remo karam, right? But then again, I think for me the issue becomes what happens when you start adding up all these private little steps, right? What is the aggregate that you get, right? Like, how does this add up? What does this add up to?
It must. It has to, right? Like, if everybody starts drawing groundwater, then suddenly we will be in that depletion story, right?
And I think it also links in a circular way with this talk around the dam thing, right? Sadka Jariya. So it's interesting that you are being asked to give Sadka Jariya for your own, Jannat Kamao or Sawab Lo for a public cause.
Good, right.
But then also a lot of people are saying, so should I give Sadka Jariya or not? And so the danger there is that you might feel like you've done your part by throwing money at the problem, right?
Yes.
If you're wealthy, you can throw a lot of money at the problem.
Yes.
And you might feel you're done, but you can still be, consuming 10 plastic water bottles a day. So you're still very much a part of the problem.
Right.
And just thinking that you've, done some philanthropy is not going to, you really haven't done your part. So again, the question of how much responsibility is owed by whom, to what, to whom and how.
Right. The spheres that you were talking about earlier,
Yeah.
I thought that at this point, should we close our conversation on agriculture a little bit and talk about on-farm? And whenever we think about water use on farm, there's these technology optimists out there, and right now it's the heyday of drip and sprinkler, right? Like everybody's talking about, well, this is going to solve our problems, right? And I spoke about earlier in the context of drinking water that getting, in that experiment I did in Karachi, getting households to use something as simple as chlorine for their own benefit, immediate benefit, was so difficult. But, and so, getting people to adopt technologies is very non-trivial. So when engineers and technocrats, they latch on to some technology solution, they think this is going to solve our problems. It's very difficult because it's actually, there's a lot more to it, like there's, getting people to adopt technology is not easy. And we, in agriculture, we see this repeatedly, right? Like there's, the Poverty Action Lab at MIT and all that network of researchers has done a lot of work in agriculture. And they find, for example, that getting farmers to adopt fertilizer, it's just so hard. It's not, you have to, you're not just dumping it on them for free, you got to help them learn that it's useful for them. And so when it comes to technologies that help us use water on farm, I think we're going to hit that same wall that maybe it's not going to be a case of, well, I'll give you sprinklers and I'll give you drip and problem solved. It's not going to be that easy, I think.
No, and so this point about drip and sprinkler, yes, this silver bullet, everybody's talking about drip and sprinkler. So I just want to add that recently I read this science paper by, I think, Grafton and a bunch of other scholars, and it's interesting. So the title is The Paradox of Irrigation Efficiency.
The paradox.
The paradox, right? And so they're basically saying that the evidence that they're getting, Pakistan is not part of their study. Sample, but they've done it in many different parts. And the evidence that they're getting is that increases in efficiency may not necessarily reduce water consumption. Right? So I think again, in a very interesting way, we come back to that question of the public and the private, and how are things adding up? Are they adding up? What is the goal? Do we all agree on the shared goal? Right? Is the goal to make each farmer more efficient and productive? Because what's my takeaway from the paper is that what's happening is that what can happen is, and this makes, intuitively it makes sense, if I am being given these new technologies and I can use the water that I'm currently using to grow more, then what's to stop me from
expanding the extent or the intensity
growing on a larger area of land, growing more crops.
Or maybe growing more frequently, or switching to more water intense.
Right, so that there's no
so that's
tight
the paradox
there's no tight connection, that it doesn't logically reduce overall water consumption.
Just because engineers think it will, the behavior adjusts it somehow.
So, again, this question of, why is an Eri Patwari doing these transactions and deals and arrangements with individual farmers? Why are individual farmers doing it, right? Which again is, I think, a wider question. Tax nahi dena, kyun nahi tax dena, right? Which takes us back to the question of trust, the social contract. Kya hai social contract? Kiske darmiyan contract hai?
Yes.
So that's my thing about the sprinkler.
It's really interesting you say this. When you spoke about this, it reminded me of this word, the phrase rebound effect. And there's all these economists who've been kind of thinking about this. So, the seatbelt laws introduced in the United States in the 60s, I think, or 50s and 60s, and then again, I may be mangling
No.
maybe totally misremembering, but you know, the presumption is that if you have people obeying the law, putting on their seatbelts, there's fewer fatalities. But they found little to no effect because people are now risk-taking, were driving more in a more risky fashion. They thought, I've got a seatbelt, I'm safer. So there's something similar going on here that I'm saving water, so I might as well, let me expand to this plot as well. And you know, so there's kind of a rebound effect going on. Myra, so I guess to kind of conclude our conversation, what's your parting thought as we, you know, like given what we've spoken about, and what do you think? What's your big thought for our audience?
So I think based on what these nearly 2 years of trying to understand how water is being distributed in parts of Lahore and Kasur has taught me is that there's immense devaluation of the work that the lower tiers of the irrigation bureaucracy are doing. Right?
Okay.
So, I mean, nationally, the Patwari is the Patwari is the figure of corruption, right?
Right.
The Patwari is the perfect
It's like a
embodiment of
symbol
everything that's
yeah.
wrong with. And I mean, in many ways, it's understandable, right? So, for a lot of people, the Patwari is this colonial era figure, although
Right.
the Patwari predates the British colonial
Right.
era also, right? So, the problem is the lowest tiers, and that's where all our policies run aground. And this has been a theme in a lot of the very, very good bureaucracy literature also.
Right? So you find that people higher up the chain seem to blame the guys lower down the chain?
People higher up the chain, people who are not even part of the chain. There's just this general perception, oh, Patwari, they're terribly corrupt, right?
Right.
And I mean, as the Nehri Patwaris themselves say, कि हमारी बदकिस्मती है कि हम Nehri Patwari हैं, तो लोगों को लगता है कि हम Mal Patwari जैसे. So it's interesting that here they say that the real corruption, the big corruption is being done by Mal Patwaris, and you know, we're really just getting a bad name. But I think, so the takeaway here for me, and I think for the, you know, for people who are involved with water issues and who are, you know, thinking about all these things is that I think there's much to be gained by involving, including, incorporating the lower tiers in these processes, in these changes, right?
So I think we won't be able to help but do that, like you said. The fact is the Patwari is so critical to those local interactions.
So, you know, you can raise the price, you can raise IANA, you can come up with a new tax, but when it comes to assessment, really, you know, like you said, when the rubber hits the road, what are these other tiers of the bureaucracy thinking, right? Like, what is the ethical or whatever calculation that the Patwari thinks he is a part of, right? Why are people not wanting to pay IANA to the Irrigation Department, to the state, the provincial exchequer? Why are they more comfortable with these other arrangements that they have?
With the local Patwari, for example.
Yeah, so I just say, and also that, you know, the Patwari, the kind of work that the Patwari does is, so Patwari has immense knowledge, has immense experience, knows everyone, knows everything. So getting the Patwari, the Ziledar, these people on board is how your policies stand a chance, right? Otherwise, you're left with reform after reform after reform, and then stories of it failed, why did it fail, what went wrong.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, so unless that ill will, that suspicion goes...
For the lower tiers.
Yeah.
I was going to say, you know, I mentioned a gripe. I said I have a gripe, and it has to do with data. You know, I just feel like what we need to see more of is just better data collection. You know, for my own work on irrigation, I had to go out and use a flow meter to measure discharge myself at the lower levels of the canal system.
And are these expensive?
No, I mean, I managed it within a graduate student budget. It worked out, but it's expensive in my time, and I had to do that myself, and that data should be out there anyway, right? And some data is available, but it's not easy to get a hold of. And, you know, people are very cagey. Departments that it's difficult to get data. It's like a bank. You gotta, I don't know, it's very hard to get data out of them. So I really think so I agree. I think part of the solution is recognizing and leveraging those, you know, the reality, the institutional reality, especially the lower tiers of our, you know, water bureaucracy and our water management. And then we've got to couple that with real sensibility, real rationality. That's going to come from when you engage academics and scientists and let them have data and tell you what the realities are and how you need to sort of deal with it. Otherwise, we're going to be kind of stuck a bit, I think. But anyway, Myra, thank you so much. That was a great conversation. Good talking to you. Yeah. Thank you, everyone.